What if the story of civilization did not begin where we were first taught to look? What if the opening chapter did not rise along the Nile beneath later pyramids, but earlier, still in a flatter, quieter land where rivers split and wandered instead of flowing straight? You stand at the edge of that question now, not as a challenge to history, but as an invitation to slow down and listen. Most historians agree that Sumerian civilization flourished long before Egypt's dynasties carved their names into stone. Archaeology suggests that organized cities, writing law, and ritual administration appeared in southern Mesopotamia thousands of years earlier than the age of pharaohs. The evidence we do have points to a people already thinking in long timelines, already recording memory in clay, already asking who had the right to rule and why. And yet, the tone of those earliest records feels different from later royal boasts. They are quieter, more procedural, almost hesitant. You imagine yourself standing in a reed, built settlement near the rivers, the air warm, the ground damp beneath your feet. There is no monument announcing supremacy, no singular figure dominating the horizon. Authority here feels dispersed, shared between temples, councils, and kings, whose power seems conditional rather than absolute. One interpretation is that early rule was less about domination and more about coordination. Someone had to organize water labor storage and ritual. Someone had to keep balance. Historians still argue whether these early rulers were primarily administrators or religious intermediaries. Some texts blur the line completely. A king might be described as chosen by the gods, instructed by them, or even advised by figures who do not act like distant deities, but like overseers close at hand. Not creators of the universe, but managers of systems. That ambiguity matters. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian texts introduce beings who are neither fully human nor abstract forces. They observe, they instruct, they measure. Later traditions would call them gods, but in the earliest layers they behave more like watchers. One interpretation is that these figures reflect human authority elevated through storytelling. Another careful explanation could be that they symbolize institutional memory rules made timeless by placing them beyond human lifespan. And yet, when you read the language slowly, some descriptions feel uncomfortably specific. A fringe idea proposes that these watchers were remembered leaders, from an even earlier age, preserved through myth, after their names and faces were lost. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it tries to answer a lingering discomfort. Why do the earliest stories already speak of rule as something inherited? Why does power seem older than kingship itself? You are not here to prove anything tonight. We are not confirming hidden rulers or uncovering forbidden truths. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. You feel the pace slow deliberately now. The sound of water becomes a steady backdrop. Clay tablets dry in the sun. Scribal hands press symbols that will outlast the people who wrote them. In those marks, authority becomes permanent. Memory becomes portable. One interpretation is that writing itself was the first true watcher observing generations silently. Most historians agree that Egypt would later develop its own powerful and distinctive vision of divine kingship. But that comes later. For now, You are standing earlier than pyramids, earlier than crowns shaped like animals, earlier than the certainty of God. Kings. You are in a place where rule is still being negotiated. And what if the Watchers were never rulers in the way we imagine at all? What if they were roles, expectations, systems given voices so people could listen? That possibility does not close the question. It opens it gently. You take a breath. The journey has begun, and nothing is rushing you forward. You remain in the same landscape, but something subtle shifts. The air feels thicker with intention now. The rivers still move at their own pace, but alongside them another current begins to form. This one is quieter. It runs through hands, through tools, through the slow repetition of marks pressed into soft clay. Most historians agree that writing in Sumeria did not begin as literature or prophecy. Archaeology suggests that the earliest clay tablets were practical records, lists of grain, counts of livestock, notes on labor owed and labor completed. The evidence we do have points to a society trying to manage complexity rather than celebrate itself. Memory was becoming external, responsibility was being tracked, obligation was being fixed in place. You picture a scribe seated low to the ground, stylus in hand, eyes focused not on the horizon, but on the tablet itself. Each mark is deliberate, nothing decorative, nothing emotional, just enough information to make tomorrow possible. One interpretation is that writing emerged not from imagination, but from pressure. Too many people, too much grain, too many promises to remember. Historians still argue whether these early tablets were meant only for administrators, or whether they already carried symbolic weight. Some scholars suggest that the very act of writing transformed authority. Once something was written, it no longer depended on memory or personal power. It became fixed, durable, impersonal. A more cautious explanation could be that writing simply made existing hierarchies visible, but even that visibility changes things. What's broadly accepted is that alongside accounting records, mythic language appears surprisingly early. Gods are named, roles are assigned, duties are described. These texts do not read like spontaneous stories. They feel curated, maintained, almost audited. One interpretation is that myth and administration grew together, each reinforcing the other. If rules come from the gods, then recording them becomes sacred work. You begin to notice a pattern. The divine figures described in these early texts do not spend much time creating worlds or judging souls. Instead, they allocate resources. They assign tasks. They oversee boundaries. They watch. A careful reading might suggest that these gods behave less like distant cosmic beings and more like idolized supervisors. A popular rumor claims that these Watcher figures represent non-human overseers guiding early civilization. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence supporting it is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it raises more questions than answers. Why would such beings need grain tallies? Why would they care about missing sheep? The mystery here is not enhanced by assuming outsiders. It may be complicated enough already. The evidence we do have points to something more grounded. Writing allows authority to persist beyond the lifespan of any one person. A ruler can die, a priest can be replaced, but a tablet remains. One interpretation is that writing itself became a silent watcher, observing compliance, preserving order, and reminding each generation of expectations set long ago. You feel how this changes the tone of power. Rule no longer depends solely on presence or charisma. It depends on systems, on archives, on rooms filled with drying tablets that quietly insist on continuity. A fringe idea proposes that later myths of eternal overseers emerged from this experience of impersonal authority. When rules outlive rulers, they begin to feel inhuman. Archaeology suggests that scribes held an unusual position in Sumerian society. They were not kings, they were not laborers, they were intermediaries. One interpretation is that they translated the will of institutions into daily reality. Another cautious explanation could be that they simply recorded what others decided. Historians still argue whether scribes shaped policy or merely preserved it. You imagine walking past a storage building, hearing the faint scrape of stylus on clay inside. That sound becomes a motif. Soft, repetitive, unemotional. It does not threaten. It does not persuade. It simply records. Over time, that record gains authority. Not because it is loud, but because it endures. What if the Watchers were never beings at all? What if they were the sensation of being observed by systems you cannot see, rules you did not write, obligations inherited rather than chosen? That possibility does not dissolve the mystery. It reframes it. You are still early in the journey. Egypt remains far ahead. For now, you are learning how power learned to watch quietly. You notice that the language begins to change as you move deeper into the tablets. The tone is no longer purely practical. Names appear more frequently now, not just of places or goods, but of beings who seem to stand slightly apart from ordinary life. They are not everywhere, but when they appear, the text slows around them as if giving them room. Most historians agree that Sumerian mythology developed alongside the growth of cities rather than long after. Archaeology suggests that divine figures were already woven into explanations of order, justice, and labor at an early stage. The evidence we do have points to gods who were not distant abstractions, but participants in how the world was organized. They assigned domains. They settled disputes. They watched outcomes. You sit with the word Watcher for a moment. It does not appear as a formal title in most translations, yet the behavior fits. These beings observe human activity. They react when balance is disrupted. They intervene quietly rather than dramatically. One interpretation is that this reflects how authority actually functioned. Oversight mattered more than spectacle. Continuity mattered more than conquest. Historians still argue whether these divine figures were ever meant to be understood as literal beings, or whether they served as narrative tools to explain social rules. Some scholars lean towards symbolism. Others point out that ancient people did not separate myth from reality in the modern sense. A more cautious explanation could be that these stories operated on multiple levels at once. They could be believed, respected, and used without needing a single definition. What's broadly accepted is that figures later grouped as the Anunnaki appear as decision-makers rather than creators. They meet, they deliberate, they allocate responsibility. This is not the language of chaos, it is the language of governance. A careful reading might suggest that these Watchers reflect councils of authority rather than solitary rulers. You imagine a gathering not of thunder, wielding gods, but of figures seated together discussing outcomes. The scene feels administrative, almost familiar. One interpretation is that early people projected their own systems upward, giving cosmic weight to human processes. Another possibility is quieter, that the Watchers represented ideals of oversight that no single human could fully embody. A fringe idea proposes that these Watchers were remembered elites from a time before written history, preserved through myth, after their social structures collapsed. This theory is debated and not widely accepted. The evidence supporting it is thin and indirect. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it raises an interesting question. Why do the earliest myths already assume a past filled with authority figures rather than beginnings from nothing? The evidence we do have points to something more restrained. Early Sumerian stories rarely glorify their Watchers as flawless. They disagree, they make mistakes, they react to consequences. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it hints at figures modeled after lived experience rather than unreachable perfection. You feel how this shapes the mood of belief. These are not gods demanding worship for its own sake. They are overseers ensuring that systems function. Water flows where it should. Labor is distributed. Boundaries are respected. One interpretation is that the divine was used to stabilize cooperation in large populations. A more cautious explanation could be that myth provided language for accountability when no single human authority was trusted absolutely. Archaeology suggests that as cities grew, personal relationships were no longer enough to maintain order. Someone did not always know the person enforcing a rule. That distance creates anxiety. Who is watching? Who remembers? Who ensures fairness? The Watchers answer that unease. A popular rumor claims that these figures were outsiders, guiding humanity from above. This idea persists in modern retellings, but it does not sit comfortably with the texts themselves. If the Watchers were external and superior, their preoccupation with irrigation schedules and labor quotas feels strangely mundane. The mystery isn't solved by making them grander. It might be more revealing to keep them ordinary. Historians still argue whether the Watchers were meant to inspire obedience or reassurance. Were they there to threaten punishment or to promise stability? The texts do not shout, they instruct, they remind, they repeat. That repetition is important. Over time, being watched becomes less frightening and more expected. You imagine a worker pausing at the edge of a field, knowing the measurement of grain will be recorded later. The Watcher is not a figure in the sky. It is the certainty that the count will happen. That memory will persist. One interpretation is that divine oversight emerged from this experience of predictable accounting. What if the Watchers were never rulers in the flesh? What if they were the feeling of continuity itself? The sense that actions mattered beyond the moment. That balance would be restored even if no one was watching directly. You let that idea settle. It does not close the question. It softens it. The Watchers remain undefined, and that may be intentional. The cities feel heavier now. Not larger, but more settled, as if their weight has pressed into the ground over generations. You sense how repetition turns movement into pattern. Canals are no longer experiments. Fields are no longer temporary. The landscape has been reshaped enough times that it begins to resist change. Most historians agree that irrigation was the backbone of early Sumerian survival. Archaeology suggests that canals required constant coordination, repair, and agreement. The evidence we do have points to a fragile balance. Too much water could destroy crops. Too little could starve a city. Someone had to decide when gates opened and closed. Someone had to watch the flow. You walk along a canal bank in your imagination, hearing water slide past packed earth. It does not roar. It murmurs. That sound carries responsibility with it. One interpretation is that whoever controlled water controlled life. A more cautious explanation could be that water management demanded collective oversight rather than centralized power. Either way, watching mattered. Historians still argue whether early authority emerged from religious leadership or practical necessity. Some scholars propose that temples became power centers because they coordinated labor and storage. Others suggest that practical leaders later adopted religious language to legitimize their decisions. The texts do not fully settle this debate. They blur it. What's broadly accepted is that water appears repeatedly in Sumerian myth as both gift and threat. Floods are remembered. Droughts are feared. The Watcher figures associated with water do not behave like chaotic forces. They regulate. They warn. They intervene quietly. A careful reading might suggest that these stories mirror real anxieties around environmental unpredictability. You imagine a leader standing near a gate mechanism, weighing the risk of opening it. There is no perfect answer. Delay too long, and fields suffer. Open too early, and homes flood. One interpretation is that attributing these decisions to divine instruction reduced conflict. If the Watchers decide humans can comply without blame. A more cautious explanation could be that this language protected leaders from resentment. The evidence we do have points to increasing complexity as cities expanded. More people meant more interdependence. A single failure could ripple outward. Oversight became essential. Watching became institutional. A fringe idea proposes that myths of watchers emerged because people felt constantly observed by systems beyond their control. This idea is debated and speculative, but it aligns with the emotional experience of living inside a tightly managed environment. Archaeology suggests that canal maintenance involved scheduled labor, recorded obligations, and penalties for neglect. These are not signs of casual organization. They indicate sustained oversight. One interpretation is that early gods embodied these systems to make them feel permanent. When rules feel eternal, compliance feels safer than resistance. You notice that the Watchers rarely demand affection. They do not ask for love. They ask for alignment, balance, cooperation. That distinction matters. These are not gods of passion. They are gods of process. A careful explanation could be that early belief prioritized stability over transcendence. Historians still argue whether fear or trust motivated participation in these systems. Were people compelled by threat of punishment or reassured by shared structure? The texts allow both readings. Punishments exist, but so do warnings and guidance. The tone is managerial rather than tyrannical. A popular rumor claims that ancient canal systems were too advanced for their time, implying external guidance. This theory isn't widely accepted. The evidence shows gradual development, experimentation, and failure. If we treat technological sophistication as a human response to necessity rather than mystery, the story becomes more grounded. The Watchers then appear not as outsiders, but as symbolic reflections of collective learning. You pause beside the water again. It continues regardless of belief. That may be the point. Nature does not care who watches. Humans do. One interpretation is that assigning watchers to natural systems gave people a sense of dialogue with forces they could not fully control. A more cautious explanation could be that myth provided emotional structure around risk. What if the Watchers were born from this tension? The need to manage what cannot be dominated, the desire to feel that someone somewhere is paying attention. That possibility does not require supernatural rulers. It requires uncertainty. You feel how this connects back to writing. Water schedules become tablets. Labor assignments become lists. The canal itself becomes a line that must be maintained. Watching becomes distributed across people tools and stories. Most historians agree that these systems laid the groundwork for later centralized authority. But here in this earlier phase, power feels negotiated rather than imposed. The Watchers are present, but not overwhelming. They supervise more than command. You move on slowly, carrying the sound of water with you. The city breathes around it. The question remains open. Who was watching? And why did it matter so much that someone was? You begin to feel the shift from systems to symbols. The canals and tablets remain, but something new settles over the city like a slow shadow. Authority starts to wear a face. Not a single face everywhere, but enough faces that leadership feels recognizable. Titles appear. Lineages are hinted at. Power begins to sound inherited. Most historians agree that early Sumerian kingship emerged gradually rather than all at once. Archaeology suggests that the earliest kings were closer to civic managers than divine monarchs. The evidence we do have points to leaders who coordinated labor-resolved disputes and represented their cities in ritual contexts. They were important, but not untouchable. You imagine a king seated on a low platform, not elevated far above others. He listens as much as he speaks. His authority depends on cooperation. One interpretation is that early kings ruled by consensus more than command. A more cautious explanation could be that coercion existed but was softened by ritual language. Historians still argue whether kingship was originally secular and later sacralized or religious from the beginning. The texts do not fully resolve this. Some kings are described as chosen by the gods. Others appear as stewards acting on behalf of temples. The boundary between ruler and servant, servant, remains thin. What's broadly accepted is that divine endorsement becomes increasingly important as cities grow. When populations expand, personal trust is no longer enough. A careful reading might suggest that claiming support from watcher figures allowed kings to stabilize their position without relying solely on force. If the watchers approve, resistance becomes more complicated. You notice that kings rarely claim absolute power in early texts. Instead, they emphasize duty, responsibility, burden. One interpretation is that kingship was framed as service rather than privilege. A more cautious explanation could be that this framing was strategic, designed to reduce resentment. Either way, it reveals anxiety about legitimacy. The Watchers appear again here, hovering just above the human ruler. They advise, they warn, they grant favor, but they can withdraw it. This dynamic is important. It suggests that kings are not the ultimate authority. Someone is still watching them. One interpretation is that this reflects social checks on power. Another possibility is that it preserves older institutional authority beneath newer personal rule. A fringe idea proposes that these Watchers represent a class of rulers predating kingship itself, remembered dimly through myth. This idea is debated and lacks direct evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it highlights an interesting tension. Why does authority in these stories always seem inherited from somewhere else? The evidence we do have points to continuity rather than rupture. Kings did not invent power. They stepped into it. They inherited systems already in motion: irrigation schedules, labor records, ritual calendars. One interpretation is that kings became the public face of systems that already watched everyone. Archaeology suggests that early kings were closely tied to temples. They built, they repaired, they sponsored rituals. They did not stand apart from religious life. A more cautious explanation could be that religion provided the language through which authority was understood. The Watchers then functioned as guarantors of continuity rather than active rulers. You imagine a ritual taking place at dusk. The king participates, but he is not the focus. The focus is alignment with the city, with the land, with unseen overseers who represent balance. The Watchers are not worshipped here as personalities. They are acknowledged as forces of order. Historians still argue whether early kings genuinely believed in divine oversight or used it as political theatre. The texts do not allow us to see inside their minds. That uncertainty matters. Belief and strategy can coexist. A king can believe in Watchers and also benefit from invoking them. A popular rumor claims that early kings were taught directly by Watchers receiving advanced knowledge. This theory is not widely accepted. The evidence shows gradual development of technology and administration. If knowledge came from somewhere, it came from accumulated experience rather than sudden revelation. The mystery here is quieter. Why does power feel uncomfortable standing alone? Why does it keep pointing upward? One interpretation is that no individual wanted full responsibility for outcomes beyond their control. Floods, famine, disease. Attributing ultimate authority to Watchers spreads the weight. You feel how this shapes culture. When rulers answer to Watchers, subjects gain a strange comfort. The king can be questioned indirectly, appealed to through ritual, blamed less personally. A more cautious explanation could be that this structure reduced violence by offering symbolic mediation. Most historians agree that later civilizations would push kingship further into divinity. But here, in this earlier phase, the balance still holds. Kings are watched. The Watchers are present, but distant. Power circulates rather than concentrates. You carry this image forward. A city governed by people who govern themselves, watched by stories that remind them of limits. The Watchers do not rule directly. They set the ceiling. What if that was the point? Not domination, but restraint. Not control, but continuity. That possibility does not answer every question. It steadies the ground beneath them. You notice how names begin to repeat as you move forward. Not just kings, but groups, collectives, titles that feel older than individuals. The Watchers no longer appear as isolated presences. They form assemblies, councils, circles of authority that feel deliberately shared. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki emerge in Sumerian texts as a group rather than a single ruling figure. Archaeology suggests that their roles were distributed, each associated with specific domains like waterland law or fertility. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where power was never meant to sit in one place for long. You picture a council not unlike those that governed early cities. Decisions reached through discussion. Authority spread across multiple voices. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki reflect this civic structure projected into myth. A more cautious explanation could be that myth provided a way to imagine stability beyond the lifespan of any council. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were originally God's deified ancestors or symbolic roles embedded in storytelling. The texts themselves shift over time. Early references feel functional. Later ones grow more ceremonial. That evolution matters. It suggests that meaning accumulated rather than appeared fully formed. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki rarely act alone. They deliberate. They respond collectively. This is not the language of absolute rulers. It is the language of shared oversight. A careful reading might suggest that these Watchers represent the memory of collective decision-making in societies where cooperation was essential. You feel how different this is from later ideas of singular divine authority. Here, no one voice dominates permanently. Even the most prominent Watchers answer to balance. When something goes wrong, responsibility is distributed. That diffusion of blame and credit feels intentional. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were remembered administrators from a lost advanced society. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence supporting it is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it raises a quieter question. Why do these figures feel so procedural? Why do they behave more like officials than mythic heroes? The evidence we do have points to societies wrestling with scale. As populations grew, no single leader could manage everything. Councils formed, roles specialized, oversight became layered. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki embody this layered authority lifted into story to give it permanence. Archaeology suggests that early temples functioned as hubs of redistribution, rather than purely spiritual centers. Grain flowed in and out, labor was assigned, disputes were settled. A more cautious explanation could be that temples provided administrative continuity. The Watchers then appear as idealized versions of this continuity. You imagine entering a temple courtyard. There is no dramatic spectacle, just order. Storage rooms, scribes, officials moving with practiced calm. Above them all, the Watchers are invoked, not as saviors, but as guarantors that the system holds. That invocation feels less like worship and more like reassurance. Historians still argue whether people experience these Watchers emotionally or pragmatically. Were they feared, respected, trusted? The texts do not shout devotion. They emphasize function. That tone suggests a relationship built on expectation rather than awe. A popular rumor claims that the Anunnaki ruled humanity directly before withdrawing. This idea is common in modern retellings, but it does not align cleanly with early sources. If we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, what remains is a picture of guidance rather than domination. You notice something else. The Anunnaki are rarely described as eternal in the way later gods are. They have beginnings. They have changes. Their prominence rises and falls. That instability is revealing. One interpretation is that they reflect shifting institutions rather than fixed beings. The mystery isn't in identifying who the Watchers really were. The mystery is why early societies needed to imagine authority as collective and ongoing. What fear or hope made that necessary? You carry the sound of footsteps across stone floors with you. Not hurried, not slow, just steady. The Watchers walk with you now as ideas rather than figures. Assemblies rather than faces. What if the Anunnaki were never meant to be worshipped? What if they were meant to remind people that no one rules alone? That every decision echoes outward? That possibility does not demand belief. It invites reflection. And as the city continues to breathe around you, that reflection feels enough. You begin to feel the weight of work now. Not the abstract idea of labor, but the physical rhythm of it. Feet on packed earth, hands lifting and lowering, baskets filling and emptying. The city hums not with conversation, but with repetition. Most historians agree that large-scale construction and agriculture in Sumer depended on coordinated labor rather than forced mass slavery. Archaeology suggests that workers were organized in teams scheduled seasonally and compensated through rations. The evidence we do have points to a system that relied on participation more than terror. You imagine yourself among them, moving with others in a familiar pattern. No one explains every step. You already know what comes next, because you have done it before. One interpretation is that routine itself became a form of stability. A more cautious explanation could be that predictability was necessary in an environment where nature remained uncertain. Historians still argue whether labor in early Mesopotamia was experienced as obligation devotion or survival strategy. The texts rarely describe emotion. They record output, amounts, time. That absence is telling. It suggests that meaning was embedded in the act itself rather than explained around it. What's broadly accepted is that myth often frames labor as something assigned by higher authority. Humans work because it is their role. The Watchers oversee this division not as punishers, but as allocators. A careful reading might suggest that myth transformed necessity into purpose. If work is divinely ordered, it feels less arbitrary. You notice that in stories, the Watchers do not labor themselves. They supervise, they set boundaries, they correct imbalance. This mirrors the structure of the city. Those who manage rarely lift the heaviest loads. One interpretation is that the Watchers reflect managerial classes made timeless through story. A fringe idea proposes that humans were created solely to work for Watchers who ruled before recorded history. This theory is popular in modern retellings, but it is not widely accepted. The evidence supporting it is thin and often taken out of context. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still raises a quieter question. Why does labor need a cosmic explanation at all? The evidence we do have points to societies grappling with fairness. Who works more? Who benefits more? Who decides? Myth provides a framework where these questions are answered indirectly. The Watchers decide. The system stands above individual grievance. Archaeology suggests that rations were carefully measured. Grain, beer, oil. These are not signs of chaotic exploitation. They indicate planning, accountability. One interpretation is that oversight was designed to prevent collapse rather than extract maximum effort. A more cautious explanation could be that efficiency and fairness were intertwined. You pause to listen. The sound of work is not harsh. It is steady, almost soothing. That matters. If labor were unbearable, the system would fail. One interpretation is that early societies invested heavily in making work tolerable through ritual rhythm and shared expectation. Historians still argue whether myth primarily justified inequality or softened it. Did the Watchers exist to excuse hardship or to limit abuse? The texts allow both readings. Rules are enforced, but limits are acknowledged. Excess is criticized. Balance is praised. You imagine a supervisor checking tallies at the end of the day. The Watcher here is human, but behind him is a story that says, this counting matters. Not because he demands it, but because the world does. One interpretation is that divine oversight emerges when human oversight needs reinforcement. A popular rumor claims that early labor projects were guided by advanced knowledge gifted by Watchers. This idea is not supported by archaeological evidence. Tools evolve slowly. Techniques improve through trial and error. If there is wisdom here, it accumulates gradually. The mystery then is not hidden technology. It is motivation. Why did people continue to show up? One interpretation is that belief created cohesion. A more cautious explanation could be that survival required cooperation and belief followed. You feel the overlap. Belief and necessity feed each other. The Watchers become the story people tell themselves about why effort matters beyond today. Why fields must be maintained even when floods destroy them. Why rebuilding continues. Most historians agree that later myths exaggerate the distance between gods and humans. But here, the Watchers feel close. They care about outcomes that affect daily life. That proximity is important. It keeps belief grounded. You carry the rhythm with you as you move on. The sound of work fades, but the pattern remains. Labor has shaped not just the city, but the stories that watch over it. What if the Watchers were born from this shared exhaustion and shared hope? The need to believe that effort connects to something larger than hunger. That possibility does not require ancient rulers in the shadows. It requires people doing their best together. You continue forward, steady, unhurried, the city still breathing behind you. The memory of water returns, but this time it carries a different weight. Not the steady flow of canals, but the sudden absence of control. You feel how order carefully maintained can be undone in a single season. The land remembers this. So do the stories. Most historians agree that flood narratives appear early and repeatedly in Mesopotamian tradition. Archaeology suggests that catastrophic flooding did occur, leaving thick layers of silt across settlements. The evidence we do have points to real events powerful enough to reshape landscapes and erase entire neighborhoods. These were not gentle overflows. They were disruptions that arrived without negotiation. You imagine standing on higher ground, watching water spread where streets once were. There is no enemy to confront, no decision to reverse it. One interpretation is that such experiences taught early societies humility. A more cautious explanation could be that they taught fear. Either way, floods left psychological marks as deep as physical ones. Historians still argue whether flood myths represent single remembered disasters or accumulated memories layered together. Some scholars suggest one major event anchored the story. Others propose that repeated floods blended into a single narrative over generations. The texts themselves do not clarify this. They compress time, making centuries feel like moments. What's broadly accepted is that Watcher figures appear in these stories not as instigators of destruction, but as warners and responders. They advise. They observe imbalance. They act to restore order rather than celebrate chaos. A careful reading might suggest that these Watchers function as mediators between humanity and uncontrollable forces. You notice something important. Flood stories rarely frame disaster as random. There is almost always a reason given. Noise, overcrowding, neglect of balance. One interpretation is that this reflects human discomfort with meaningless loss. A more cautious explanation could be that assigning cause helped communities process trauma. A fringe idea proposes that flood myths preserve memory of a global catastrophe or lost civilization ruled by Watchers. This theory isn't widely accepted. The archaeological record does not support a single worldwide event at the times described. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still reveals a deep desire to explain rupture through narrative continuity. The evidence we do have points to localized disasters interpreted through shared cultural frameworks. When a city floods, survival depends on cooperation afterward. Rebuilding requires trust. Myth steps in to frame that rebuilding as restoration of order rather than endless punishment. You feel how the Watchers change tone here. They are no longer simply supervisors of routine. They become guardians of continuity. They remember what was lost. They carry instructions forward. One interpretation is that Watchers emerged most strongly in response to crisis. When human systems fail, oversight feels most necessary. Archaeology suggests that after major flood events, settlements were often rebuilt on the same sites. This is significant. People returned. They did not abandon the land permanently. A more cautious explanation could be that practical advantages outweighed fear, but belief likely played a role. The Watchers had not abandoned the place. Balance could be restored. Historians still argue whether these myths encouraged obedience or resilience. Did they warn against transgression or reassure people that order would return? The texts allow both readings. Punishment is described, but so is renewal. Survival is never framed as accidental. You imagine elders retelling the story to younger generations, not to frighten them, but to remind them. Water can rise. Systems can fail. Cooperation matters. Watching matters. One interpretation is that flood myths trained communities to respond collectively rather than fragment. A popular rumor claims that Watchers selected certain individuals to survive and rebuild. This idea appears in later retellings, but early versions emphasize instruction rather than favoritism. The survivor is not praised for virtue. He is valued for obedience and preparation. The mystery here is not the flood itself. Floods happen. The mystery is why oversight becomes more vivid after disaster. Why stories lean so heavily on watchers rather than heroes. One interpretation is that no single person could prevent catastrophe. Only systems could soften its impact. You carry that forward. The sense that being watched is not always oppressive. Sometimes it is comforting. It suggests continuity when everything else dissolves. As the water recedes in your imagination, what remains is not ruin, but memory. Clay tablets buried and rediscovered, stories told again. The watchers persist not because they dominate, but because they help people imagine recovery. You move on slowly, the sound of distant water fading, replaced by something steadier. Footsteps returning to familiar ground. Order rebuilding itself piece by piece. The city feels different again, quieter, in a way that is not empty, but contained. You sense walls, not just around space, but around behavior. Movement follows paths now. Time follows schedules. What once felt negotiated begins to feel expected. Most historians agree that Sumerian temples functioned as more than places of worship. Archaeology suggests they acted as economic centers, storing surplus, distributing rations, and coordinating labor. The evidence we do have points to institutions that blended sacred language with practical control. This overlap was not accidental. It was structural. You step into a temple courtyard in your imagination. There is no spectacle meant to overwhelm you. The power here is subtle. Orderly rooms, predictable routines. People know where to stand and when to speak. One interpretation is that temples replaced personal authority with institutional continuity. A more cautious explanation could be that they simply scaled up existing systems. Historians still argue whether temples gained power because of belief, or whether belief followed power already consolidated. Some scholars suggest people trusted temples because they managed resources fairly. Others propose that fairness was perceived because divine language discouraged challenge. The texts allow both readings to coexist. What's broadly accepted is that watcher figures are deeply embedded in temple life. They are invoked in rituals that mark time labor cycles and redistribution. They do not appear as distant beings demanding devotion, but as overseers ensuring alignment. A careful reading might suggest that temples became the earthly residence of watching itself. You notice how accountability shifts here. No single king stands alone. No individual absorbs all responsibility. Decisions are framed as alignment with divine order. If something fails, the failure is systemic rather than personal. One interpretation is that this reduced conflict by diffusing blame. A more cautious explanation could be that it protected leadership from direct accountability. The evidence we do have points to remarkable administrative sophistication. Records track inputs and outputs across seasons. Mistakes are noted. Corrections are made. This is not mystical governance. It is careful management wrapped in sacred language. One interpretation is that the Watchers provided moral authority to systems that required compliance. A fringe idea proposes that temples preserved instructions left behind by earlier Watchers who once ruled directly. This idea is debated and lacks firm evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still highlights a persistent theme. Authority in these stories always points backward to something older. Archaeology suggests that people returned repeatedly to temple centers, even after disruption. Fires, floods, political change. The buildings were repaired, rituals resumed. A more cautious explanation could be that temples held practical advantages like storage and coordination, but belief likely reinforced attachment. You feel how this shapes daily life. Work assignments come from the temple. Festivals mark time. Even rest follows institutional rhythm. The Watchers are present, not as figures you see, but as expectations you feel. One interpretation is that divine oversight became indistinguishable from social order. Historians still argue whether this integration of sacred and administrative power limited innovation or enabled it. Did stability encourage experimentation, or did it constrain deviation? The evidence is mixed. Change happens, but slowly. Continuity is prized. A popular rumor claims that temples hid secret knowledge accessible only to elites guided by watchers. This idea persists in modern imagination, but the records we have emphasize transparency in accounting rather than secrecy. If knowledge was restricted, it was often technical rather than mystical. The mystery here is subtle. Why did people accept being watched by institutions that governed so much of their lives? One interpretation is that predictability felt safer than chaos. A more cautious explanation could be that alternatives were limited. You stand in the shade of the temple wall, feeling its presence, without needing to touch it. It does not threaten. It persists. The Watchers are everywhere and nowhere, embedded in routine, reinforced by repetition. What if this is where watching truly took root? Not in the sky, but in architecture, in schedules, in the quiet expectation that tomorrow will resemble today enough to plan for it. You move on, carrying the sense that oversight has become ordinary. And when watching becomes ordinary, it no longer needs a face. You feel the horizon widen as you move beyond the city walls. The air changes subtly. It carries dust instead of damp earth motion, instead of routine. Paths stretch outward, not neatly measured like canals, but worn by feet that have traveled them many times before. Most historians agree that Sumer was never isolated. Archaeology suggests that trade routes connected southern Mesopotamia to regions far beyond its borders, moving goods, ideas, and customs across long distances. The evidence we do have points to exchange as a constant rather than an exception. Copper, timberstone, and stories all traveled together. You imagine caravans assembling at dawn, donkeys shifting under loads, traders checking seals and tallies. One interpretation is that trade required trust beyond immediate kinship. A more cautious explanation could be that it required oversight strong enough to make trust unnecessary. Either way, watching mattered. Historians still argue whether cultural influence followed material exchange or preceded it. Did ideas move because goods moved, or did shared beliefs enable trade to begin? The tablets do not give a single answer. They record transactions, not motivations. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian religious symbols appear far from their original cities. Names of gods, ritual forms, administrative styles, A careful reading might suggest that belief travelled with bureaucracy. Where accounting systems went, divine language followed. You notice that the Watchers do not remain confined to one place in these stories. They appear wherever order must be maintained across distance. Treaties, trade agreements, boundary markers. One interpretation is that Watchers represent the need for shared rules among strangers. A more cautious explanation could be that invoking common overseers reduced conflict when direct enforcement was impossible. The evidence we do have points to seals as crucial tools in long-distance trade. A seal impression stood in for a person not present. It authenticated agreements. It watched in absence. One interpretation is that seals became portable watchers, carrying authority across space. A fringe idea proposes that Watchers guided migration and trade, deliberately spreading civilization from a central source. This theory isn't widely accepted. Archaeology shows multiple centers developing independently, borrowing selectively. If we treat the idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still reflects a longing for coherence in messy historical processes. You feel how trade changes social imagination. The world grows larger. Unknown people exist beyond the horizon. Rules must hold, even when no one is watching directly. That tension creates anxiety. Who enforces agreements far away? Who remembers promises made beyond sight? Archaeology suggests that written contracts increased alongside trade expansion. Names, witnesses, clauses. These are not signs of blind trust. They are tools to extend watching across distance. One interpretation is that the Watchers evolved conceptually to meet this need. They become guarantors of order beyond immediate reach. Historians still argue whether divine oversight was invoked more strongly in situations of uncertainty. Trade certainly qualifies. Risk, delay, loss. One interpretation is that appealing to Watchers reduced anxiety by framing outcomes as part of a larger order. A more cautious explanation could be that it simply standardized expectations. A popular rumor claims that ancient trade routes were laid out according to sacred geometry taught by Watchers. This idea is appealing but unsupported. Routes follow resources, terrain, and survival needs. If there is intelligence here, it is practical rather than mysterious. You stand at a crossroads in your imagination. One path leads back to the city. Another disappears into open land. Both are watched in different ways. Inside the city, oversight is constant and visible. Outside, it becomes abstract. Stories, symbols, seals pressed into clay. The mystery here is not expansion itself, it is adaptation. How systems of watching adjust when space stretches. One interpretation is that Watchers grow more symbolic as distance increases. They become ideas rather than presences. You carry that thought with you as you move on. The city recedes behind you, but its influence does not. Watching has learned to travel. The land changes again as you follow the path south and west toward places that will later be called something else. The soil grows darker. The river narrows, then spreads. Life feels less centralized here, less enclosed by walls, but no less deliberate. Most historians agree that pre-dynastic communities along the Nile developed independently before the rise of unified Egypt. Archaeology suggests that farming villages, burial customs, and regional leadership existed long before pharaohs claimed divine authority. The evidence we do have points to gradual complexity rather than sudden emergence. You imagine standing near the riverbank at dawn. The water is calmer than the Mesopotamian floods you remember. It rises and falls with rhythm. That reliability changes everything. One interpretation is that predictable cycles allowed different kinds of authority to emerge. A more cautious explanation could be that environmental stability reduced the need for constant oversight. Historians still argue whether early Nile societies borrowed ideas directly from Mesopotamia or developed parallel solutions to similar problems. Trade did occur, symbols traveled, but cultures adapt what they receive. They do not copy blindly. The texts and artifacts suggest selective borrowing rather than wholesale adoption. What's broadly accepted is that early Egyptian belief emphasizes balance and continuity rather than supervision. Concepts later called order and harmony dominate. The Watcher figures of Sumer do not appear here in the same form. Instead, authority feels embedded in the land itself. One interpretation is that environmental predictability reduced the psychological need for external overseers. You feel the difference immediately. In Mesopotamia, watching feels necessary because nature is volatile. Here, watching feels quieter. The river keeps time, seasons repeat. One interpretation is that divine oversight becomes internalized. The land watches itself. Archaeology suggests that early Egyptian leaders were initially regional and limited in scope. They did not yet claim universal authority. A more cautious explanation could be that power had not yet found a language to scale itself. The Watchers, if they existed here at all, wear different names and faces. Historians still argue whether Egyptian kingship emerged from ritual leadership or military consolidation. The evidence supports both paths at different moments. What matters is that by the time kingship solidifies, divine authority is no longer shared. It concentrates. You pause with that realization. Something shifts here. Where Sumer imagined councils of Watchers, Egypt moves toward singular embodiment. One ruler, one axis, one living symbol of order. One interpretation is that stable environment allows power to centralize more easily. A more cautious explanation could be that social choices mattered more than climate. A fringe idea proposes that early Egyptian gods were reinterpreted Watchers from earlier traditions. This theory is debated and not widely accepted. The names, roles, and myths differ significantly. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still highlights continuity of questions rather than continuity of figures. The evidence we do have points to transformation rather than inheritance. Egyptian religion absorbs ideas and reshapes them. Where Sumer externalized oversight, Egypt internalizes it into the ruler. The king does not answer to Watchers. He becomes one. You imagine the psychological difference. In Sumer, power looks upward. In Egypt, power looks inward. The pharaoh embodies balance. If order fails, it is personal. One interpretation is that this creates stronger unity. A more cautious explanation could be that it creates vulnerability. Historians still argue whether this model was more stable or simply different. Egypt endures longer in recognizable form. But endurance does not equal simplicity. Control requires narrative reinforcement. Myth shifts accordingly. A popular rumor claims that Egypt inherited secret knowledge from an earlier ruling class, remembered in Sumerian stories. This idea persists, but evidence for direct transmission of hidden rulers is thin. Architectural techniques evolve locally. Beliefs adapt to context. If knowledge traveled, it did so openly through trade and observation. You feel the contrast deepen. The Watchers fade, not because they were disproven, but because they were no longer needed in the same way. Oversight becomes embodied. Watching becomes being. One interpretation is that societies choose the form of authority that best fits their environment. Where unpredictability reigns, councils of watchers make sense. Where rhythm dominates, singular representation emerges. You stand between these worlds now, not choosing sides, just observing divergence. The question shifts from who ruled first to why rule takes different shapes. The mystery is not whether the Watchers crossed into Egypt. It is why they did not need to. You move on slowly, letting the Nile flow beside you, steady and unbothered, as if watching were no longer required. You begin to notice how names loosen as you move forward in time. Titles remain, roles persist, but the sounds used to describe them shift. What once felt fixed starts to feel adaptable. The Watchers so clearly outlined earlier begin to blur at the edges. Most historians agree that as cultures interact, divine names and functions change rather than disappear. Archaeology suggests that gods were often absorbed, merged, or reinterpreted when societies overlapped. The evidence we do have points to continuity beneath change. Roles survive even when labels do not. You imagine a story being retold by someone who learned it secondhand. The core remains. Oversight, balance, memory. But details soften. One interpretation is that as societies evolve, they reshape authority to fit new realities. A more cautious explanation could be that older concepts persist simply because they are useful. Historians still argue whether this process represents deliberate reform or organic drift. Did leaders consciously rebrand old watchers into new forms, or did people gradually forget original meanings while preserving structure? The surviving records do not clarify intent, they only show outcome. What's broadly accepted is that later Mesopotamian cultures inherited Sumerian divine frameworks and adjusted them. Some watchers become more human, others grow more cosmic. A careful reading might suggest that oversight becomes more symbolic as societies stabilize. Watching shifts from active supervision to moral presence. You feel this transition emotionally. Early watchers felt close, involved. Later figures feel elevated, more distant. One interpretation is that as systems become self-sustaining, direct oversight feels less necessary. A more cautious explanation could be that power prefers distance once it is secure. The evidence we do have points to myth becoming more narrative-driven over time. Stories gain drama, conflict, resolution. The Watchers who once managed irrigation schedules now decide fates. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it hints at changing social needs. People no longer need constant reassurance that systems work. They need meaning. A fringe idea proposes that this shift masks the withdrawal of real watchers who once ruled directly. This theory is debated and not widely accepted. there is no archaeological trace of such a departure. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still highlights a feeling of loss embedded in later myths. Something feels farther away. You notice how later texts speak of a golden age, a time when gods walked closer to humans. This nostalgia appears across cultures. One interpretation is that it reflects longing for simpler governance. A more cautious explanation could be that distance makes authority easier to idealize. Archaeology suggests that as states grow larger, individuals feel less connected to decision-making. Oversight becomes abstract. Laws replace conversations. One interpretation is that myth compensates for this distance by imagining attentive gods. The Watchers transform into figures who see hearts rather than harvests. Historians still argue whether this change improved social cohesion or strained it. Moral oversight can unite people, but it can also create anxiety. Being watched internally is different from being watched externally. The tone of belief shifts from coordination to conscience. A popular rumor claims that ancient texts hide coded references to Watchers beneath altered names. This idea is appealing but difficult to support. Language evolves naturally. Similarities do not require secrecy. If we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, what remains is adaptation rather than concealment. You imagine a scribe copying an old story into a new language. Some words no longer fit. He chooses equivalence. Meaning survives through approximation. One interpretation is that the Watchers survive in this way, not as fixed beings, but as functions translated across time. The evidence we do have points to continuity of concern. Who ensures fairness? Who remembers agreements? Who restores balance after disruption? These questions persist even when answers change. The Watchers may fade as characters, but watching does not fade as a need. You feel how this prepares the ground for later civilizations. Authority becomes more personal again. Kings claim divine mandate. Laws invoke cosmic order. The idea of being watched shifts inward and upward at the same time. Historians still argue whether this evolution represents progress or loss. Did humanity gain autonomy or surrender comfort? The texts offer no verdict. They simply move forward. You pause with that uncertainty. The Watchers are no longer visible as they once were, but traces remain. In language, in ritual, in the feeling that actions matter beyond immediate consequence. What if the Watchers were never meant to last unchanged? What if their purpose was to guide societies through growth, then dissolve into structures that no longer needed faces? That possibility does not erase them. It completes their role. You continue on aware now that disappearance does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means integration. Stone begins to matter more now. Not because people suddenly forget clay, but because permanence becomes desirable. You feel the difference immediately. Clay remembers until it breaks. Stone remembers even when no one is listening. Most historians agree that monumental construction increases as authority consolidates. Archaeology suggests that stone structures were not only practical, but symbolic marking power that intended to last beyond a single lifetime. The evidence we do have points to architecture becoming a language of memory. You imagine walking toward a rising platform of dressed stone. It does not explain itself. It does not invite debate. It simply stands. One interpretation is that stone replaces the Watchers in physical form. Where oversight was once imagined, it is now built. A more cautious explanation could be that permanence itself reassures societies anxious about change. Historians still argue whether monuments were designed to inspire awe or obedience. Some scholars suggest that scale alone communicates authority. Others propose that familiarity mattered more than fear. People pass these structures daily. Over time, they stop questioning them. That quiet acceptance is powerful. What's broadly accepted is that monuments often encode order rather than chaos. Symmetry, alignment, repetition. These are not accidental. A careful reading might suggest that stone becomes a way to freeze balance in place. If balance can be built, it feels less fragile. You feel how different this is from earlier watchers. Stone does not watch actively. It does not intervene. It reminds. Its presence implies continuity. One interpretation is that societies externalized oversight into their environment. You do not need a watcher if the structure itself instructs behavior. Archaeology suggests that access to monumental spaces was often regulated. Not everyone could enter every area. Movement followed prescribed paths. A more cautious explanation could be that this organization reflected practical needs. But symbolism cannot be ignored. Who can approach power matters. A fringe idea proposes that monuments were designed to communicate with watchers or preserve their presence. This theory isn't widely accepted. The evidence shows construction driven by local resources and techniques. If we treat the idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still reveals a human tendency to connect permanence with transcendence. You notice how stories change when stone appears. Gods become associated with temples rather than fields. Authority becomes localized in places rather than processes. One interpretation is that the watchers settle into architecture. They no longer roam, they reside. The evidence we do have points to rituals becoming more formalized around monuments. Calendars align with spaces. Ceremonies repeat in fixed locations. This regularity creates rhythm. A more cautious explanation could be that predictability reduces conflict by clarifying expectations. You pause at the threshold of a structure, feeling how behavior adjusts automatically. Voices lower, movement slows. No one announces these rules. They are learned through repetition. One interpretation is that stone trains bodies as much as minds. Historians still argue whether this shift reduced the need for mythic watchers or simply rebranded them. The texts continue to speak of divine oversight, but its expression changes. Gods are no longer constantly intervening. They are present through place. A popular rumor claims that ancient builders encoded secret messages about earlier rulers into stone alignments. This idea persists, but evidence for intentional hidden messages is limited. Alignments often reflect practical considerations like light, climate, and visibility. If meaning exists, it is usually communal rather than secret. You feel how stone carries silence differently than clay. Clay speaks through text. Stone speaks through presence. One interpretation is that as literacy spreads among elite stone, becomes a more universal language. Anyone can feel it, even if they cannot read. Archaeology suggests that monuments often survive political change. Rulers come and go, structures remain, new leaders appropriate old buildings. A more cautious explanation could be that reuse is efficient. But symbolically, It suggests continuity beyond individual authority. You imagine a later ruler standing before an older monument, claiming connection to its builders. The Watchers are no longer named. They are implied. Authority flows backward through stone rather than story. The mystery here is subtle. Why does watching become quieter as power becomes heavier? One interpretation is that once authority is sufficiently embedded, it no longer needs to announce itself. A more cautious explanation could be that people internalize expectations over time. You carry this feeling forward. The Watchers have not vanished. They have become walls, thresholds, and lines of sight. They do not look at you. They shape where you stand. What if this was the final transformation? Watching becoming architecture, oversight becoming environment, memory becoming weight. You step away slowly, feeling the stone behind you without turning around. It does not follow. It does not need to. Time stretches here in a way that feels uneven. Some moments feel preserved, others smoothed thin by retelling. You sense gaps not as absences, but as pauses where memory chose not to linger. These pauses invite imagination, and imagination can be persuasive. Most historians agree that established chronologies of the ancient Near East are built from fragmentary evidence. Archaeology suggests that timelines are reconstructed through layers, inscriptions, and cross-comparison rather than continuous records. The evidence we do have points to long periods that are clear and others that remain indistinct. You feel how tempting it is to fill those indistinct spaces. When records thin, stories expand. One interpretation is that uncertainty encourages speculation. A more cautious explanation could be that human curiosity resists silence. We want continuity even when the past offers interruption. Historians still argue whether gaps in the record reflect true collapse migration or simply loss of material. Entire generations may pass without leaving durable traces. Floods erase, rebuilding repurposes, writing shifts medium. None of this requires catastrophe, but it creates opportunity for myth. What's broadly accepted is that later traditions often speak of earlier ages with reverence. Golden times, first rulers, ages of closeness between humans and divine forces. A careful reading might suggest that these narratives emerge when present conditions feel diminished. The past becomes elevated to explain the present. You notice how Watcher stories thrive in these imagined earlier ages. They are placed just beyond reach, before kings, as we know them, before monuments dominate the horizon. One interpretation is that Watchers inhabit the time before certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that they personify longing for simpler structures of authority. A fringe idea proposes that missing periods conceal entire forgotten civilizations ruled by Watchers. This theory isn't widely accepted. Archaeological layers do not support a hidden global culture erased without trace. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still reveals discomfort with fragmentation. We prefer lost worlds to lost records. The evidence we do have points to continuity masked by change. Pottery styles evolve. Tools adapt. Settlement patterns shift. These changes can feel abrupt when viewed in isolation, but gradual when layered properly. One interpretation is that Watcher myths compress slow transitions into singular events. You imagine a storyteller explaining why things are different now. Instead of describing centuries of adjustment, he speaks of a time when watchers withdrew. Balance changed. The story becomes easier to tell. Memory becomes manageable. Archaeology suggests that societies often explain complexity by inventing beginnings. Clear origins help anchor identity. A more cautious explanation could be that origin stories reduce anxiety by offering narrative closure. Watchers function well in this role. They arrive, they oversee, they depart. Order shifts. You feel how this framing affects perception of authority. If watchers, once ruled and left current rulers, inherit a diminished world, their power feels provisional. One interpretation is that this limits arrogance. A more cautious explanation could be that it excuses failure. Things were better before. A popular rumor claims that ancient texts hide precise dates marking the rule of watchers. This idea persists, but numerical symbolism often outweighs literal chronology. Numbers signify completeness cycles or divinity rather than calendar years. If meaning exists, it is conceptual rather than historical. You pause with the realization that time itself becomes a character here. The past watches the present. The future remains undefined. The watchers occupy the threshold. One interpretation is that they personify the feeling that history is observing us. A more cautious explanation could be that they help societies negotiate responsibility across generations. The evidence we do have points to a pattern. When societies face change, they cannot fully explain, they turn to myth to stabilize identity. Watchers offer a bridge between what was and what is. They legitimize transition without detailing it. Historians still argue whether such myths hinder understanding or preserve it. Do they obscure real processes or encode them in symbolic form? The answer may be both. Myth simplifies, but it also remembers in ways raw data cannot. You imagine standing at a site where layers of occupation blur together. No sign marks where one era ends and another begins. Only gradual shifts, only accumulated wear. One interpretation is that continuity matters more than precision. A more cautious explanation could be that precision was never available. The mystery here is not whether watchers ruled before Egypt. It is why people feel the need to imagine rulers before rulers. Why authority is pushed backward into mist rather than anchored only in the present. You sense that the watchers thrive in these blurred zones. They are not bound to dates. They inhabit transition. They appear when certainty thins and memory stretches. What if the watchers were never lost rulers at all? What if they were the language people used to speak about time itself? Oversight across generations. Responsibility inherited rather than chosen. That possibility does not require missing civilizations. It requires patience with ambiguity. You move forward slowly, accepting that not every gap is an invitation to fill. Some are invitations to pause, to notice how much survives despite what does not. The watchers remain there, not behind you, not ahead, but alongside, in the spaces where history softens and imagination steadies it. You feel the pressure of symbols, now not as decoration, but as instruction. Marks appear everywhere, on walls, on seals, on objects passed from hand to hand. Meaning is no longer carried only by stories told aloud. It is fixed, repeatable, and quietly authoritative. Most historians agree. that the expansion of writing transformed how power was exercised in ancient societies. Archaeology suggests that literacy was limited to trained specialists, creating a boundary between those who recorded decisions and those who followed them. The evidence we do have points to writing becoming a tool of control as much as communication. You imagine a tablet being pressed with care, the stylus leaving grooves that will harden and last. One interpretation is that writing allowed authority to travel beyond presence. A more cautious explanation could be that it simply reduced confusion. Either way, once something is written, it begins to watch. Historians still argue whether early laws were meant to protect the weak or stabilize hierarchy. The earliest legal texts outline obligations, penalties, and procedures. They rarely explain motives. That silence is important. It suggests that order mattered more than justification. What's broadly accepted is that law codes invoke divine oversight. Rules are not presented as personal opinions. They are framed as aligned with cosmic order. A careful reading might suggest that the Watchers migrated into text itself. The law watches. The tablet remembers. You notice how this changes responsibility. A person enforcing a rule can point to the tablet. The tablet points upward. One interpretation is that this diffusion of accountability reduced personal conflict. A more cautious explanation could be that it protected enforcers from blame. A fringe idea proposes that writing was taught to humans by Watchers to maintain control after direct rule ended. This theory isn't widely accepted. Archaeological evidence shows gradual development from pictographs to complex scripts. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still highlights a perception. Writing feels external. It arrives as a system, not an instinct. The evidence we do have points to increasing abstraction. Symbols stand in for objects. Objects stand in for obligations. Obligations stand in for relationships. One interpretation is that watching becomes layered. The Watchers are no longer figures or councils. They are embedded in symbols that outlive individuals. Archaeology suggests that seals played a crucial role in this shift. A seal impression validated identity without requiring presence. It acted as a surrogate watcher. A more cautious explanation could be that seals simply improved efficiency. But their symbolic power cannot be ignored. They authenticate reality. Historians still argue whether this symbolic oversight empowered institutions more than individuals. Literacy concentrates authority. Those who can read and write interpret reality for others. One interpretation is that Watchers became interpreters rather than rulers. You imagine standing before a scribe, reading aloud a decree. The words are not debated, they are received. The Watcher here is not visible. It is the expectation that the words matter, that they connect to something larger. A popular rumor claims that hidden meanings encoded in ancient texts reveal Watchers guiding events behind the scenes. This idea persists, but it relies on selective reading. The texts themselves emphasize clarity over secrecy. If meaning was hidden, it was often symbolic rather than conspiratorial. You feel how writing reshapes belief. When order is written, it feels permanent. When it feels permanent, it feels inevitable. One interpretation is that writing reduces the need for active watchers by making oversight constant. A more cautious explanation could be that belief adapts to technology. The mystery here is subtle. When does watching stop feeling external and start feeling internal? When do people follow rules? Because they are observed, and when? Because they are written. One interpretation is that this shift marks a turning point in human self-regulation. Historians still argue whether this development increased freedom or constrained it. Written law can protect against arbitrary power. It can also freeze inequality. The evidence supports both outcomes at different times. You pause with the tablet in your imagination. It does not move. It does not judge. But it holds. And in holding it watches. What if this was the Watcher's final form? Not beings, not councils, not even monuments, but systems of symbols that remember for us. That possibility does not diminish the mystery. It brings it closer. Watching no longer comes from above. It comes from what we create and agree to obey. You carry that thought forward as the marks fade behind you, replaced by something quieter. A sense that oversight has become ordinary and therefore more powerful. You feel the boundaries soften again. Roles that once seemed distinct begin to overlap. The watcher, the ruler, the priest, the administrator. They no longer stand in separate places. They share space, sometimes even the same voice. Most historians agree that in mature ancient societies, authority was rarely held by a single class alone. Archaeology suggests that priests, kings, and officials often performed overlapping duties, especially in moments of crisis or transition. The evidence we do have points to systems that relied on flexibility rather than rigid separation. You imagine a figure standing at a threshold, part ritual leader, part judge, part organizer. He does not announce which role he is performing. The context decides. One interpretation is that early societies valued function over title. A more cautious explanation could be that specialization had not yet fully crystallized. Historians still argue whether priesthood or kingship held ultimate authority at different times. Some periods emphasize ritual leadership. Others elevate military or administrative power. The records show oscillation rather than resolution. That instability is important. It suggests that no single model felt permanently sufficient. What's broadly accepted is that divine language permeated all these roles. Decisions were framed as aligned with cosmic order. Disputes were settled with reference to higher balance. A careful reading might suggest that watchers became the shared justification for multiple forms of authority. They were flexible enough to support whoever needed them. You notice how this affects accountability. When a priest speaks, the watchers are invoked. When a king commands, the watchers are invoked. When a law is enforced, the watchers are invoked. One interpretation is that this diffusion of oversight prevented power from concentrating too visibly. A more cautious explanation could be that it obscured responsibility. The evidence we do have points to frequent negotiation between institutions. Temples compete. Kings bargain. Councils intervene. Authority is not static. It is contested. One interpretation is that watcher myths provided a neutral ground. No matter who acted, they claimed alignment with the same overseeing order. A fringe idea proposes that priests preserved secret knowledge, inherited from watchers, giving them hidden power over kings. This theory isn't widely accepted. Archaeological evidence shows open ritual practices and public inscriptions, rather than concealed instruction. If we treat the idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reflects suspicion toward intermediaries rather than proof of secrecy. You feel how mediation becomes central here. Authority is no longer simply exercised. It is explained, justified, framed. One interpretation is that societies grew too complex for raw power to function without narrative support. A more cautious explanation could be that explanation itself became a form of power. Archaeology suggests that ritual spaces often doubled as legal venues. Disputes were resolved in places associated with divine presence. A more cautious explanation could be that these spaces were central and accessible. But symbolism matters. Justice delivered under the gaze of watchers feels different than justice delivered privately. Historians still argue whether this blending of sacred and civic roles strengthened social cohesion or created tension. The evidence shows both cooperation and conflict. Priests challenge kings. Kings reform temples. The watchers remain invoked by all sides. You imagine a disagreement unfolding. Two parties argue. A mediator listens. The final decision references balanced tradition and divine order. One interpretation is that invoking watchers allowed decisions to feel final. A more cautious explanation could be that it discouraged appeal. A popular rumor claims that watchers directly selected certain individuals to serve as priests or kings. This idea appears in later legends, but early records emphasize lineage training and political circumstance. If selection felt divine, it was often retroactively framed that way. You notice how personal belief becomes harder to separate from public role. A priest may sincerely believe in oversight. A king may believe strategically. A scribe may believe procedurally. All beliefs coexist within the same system. One interpretation is that watchers functioned as a shared language across differing motivations. The mystery here is not who truly believed. Belief does not need uniformity to function. What matters is participation. Everyone acts as if the watchers matter. That collective behavior creates reality. Historians still argue whether this collective belief limited dissent or enabled stability. Invoking shared oversight can unify. It can also suppress alternative views. The texts show praise for order and warnings against disruption. Innovation occurs, but carefully. You feel the tension. Watching can be comforting. It can also be constraining. One interpretation is that societies accept this trade-off willingly. A more cautious explanation could be that alternatives feel riskier. As you move through this layered authority, you sense the watchers thinning again. Not disappearing, but becoming background. Their names are less central, their presence assumed rather than emphasized. What if this is the moment where watching becomes cultural reflex, no longer questioned, no longer dramatized, simply part of how decisions are made? You pause with that thought. When oversight becomes ordinary, it stops needing explanation. The watchers no longer need to rule. They have taught people how to rule themselves within limits they still respect. You move forward, aware that something has shifted quietly. Authority no longer points upward as often. It circulates sideways, embedded in roles that adapt as needed. The watchers remain, but now they speak through people, through institutions, through habits that feel older than memory. You sense the tone becoming reflective now, not uncertain, but aware of its own limits. The stories no longer rush to explain everything. They pause more often. They acknowledge disagreement. They leave space where answers might have once been expected. Most historians agree that as ancient traditions matured, they became more comfortable with ambiguity. Archaeology suggests that later texts preserve multiple versions of the same story rather than enforcing a single account. The evidence we do have points to cultures that tolerated contradiction without seeing it as failure. You imagine a scribe copying two differing versions of a myth onto separate tablets, neither erased, neither corrected. One interpretation is that preserving debate mattered as much as preserving belief. A more cautious explanation could be that standardization was never fully achievable across regions and generations. Historians still argue whether this multiplicity reflects confusion or sophistication. Some scholars see it as fragmentation. Others view it as intellectual humility. The past did not always demand closure. Sometimes it accepted tension. What's broadly accepted is that Watcher figures become less defined in these later layers. Their roles blur. Their authority diffuses. They are referenced but not explained in detail. A careful reading might suggest that once oversight was fully internalized into law, ritual, and habit, it no longer needed vivid representation. You feel how different this is from earlier certainty. There is no urgency to prove who ruled first. The question itself feels less important than the process of asking it. One interpretation is that societies learned to live with unresolved origins. A more cautious explanation could be that practical concerns overtook mythic ones. The evidence we do have points to increased philosophical reflection. Texts question justice, fate, human limitation. The Watchers appear not as answers, but as part of the question. Who decides? Who watches the Watchers? These concerns feel familiar. A fringe idea proposes that contradictions in ancient texts were intentionally planted to conceal hidden truths. This theory isn't widely accepted. The simpler explanation is often more convincing. Complex societies produce complex records. If we treat the idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still highlights discomfort with uncertainty. You notice how debate itself becomes institutionalized. Schools of interpretation emerge. Priests argue, scribes comment. No single voice dominates permanently. One interpretation is that authority becomes dialogic rather than declarative. A more cautious explanation could be that power disperses when it cannot fully control narrative. Archaeology suggests that libraries and archives grow during this period. Texts are collected rather than replaced. Memory becomes layered. A more cautious explanation could be administrative necessity. But, symbolically, it suggests respect for plurality. Historians still argue whether this pluralism weakened belief or strengthened it. Multiple interpretations can dilute certainty. They can also deepen engagement. The evidence shows continued ritual participation alongside intellectual debate. Belief adapts rather than collapses. You feel how the Watchers change again. They no longer need to supervise daily life. They hover as conceptual guardians of order rather than active managers. One interpretation is that they be metaphors for responsibility itself. A more cautious explanation could be that they recede as human confidence grows. A popular rumor claims that this period marks the deliberate suppression of Watcher traditions by emerging elites. This idea persists, but evidence for coordinated erasure is limited. Stories fade for many reasons. Language changes. Priorities shift. Silence does not always mean suppression. The mystery here is gentle? Why do societies eventually stop insisting on singular answers? Why does debate become acceptable? One interpretation is that survival teaches flexibility. A more cautious explanation could be that complexity demands it. You pause, with the feeling that not knowing is no longer threatening. The Watchers do not need to be clearly defined to function. Oversight exists as shared responsibility. Memory exists as dialogue rather than decree. Historians still argue whether this openness paved the way for later philosophical traditions. The evidence suggests continuity rather than rupture. Questions persist even as gods recede. You imagine standing in a library, shelves of tablets around you. No voice tells you which one is correct. You are trusted to read, compare, and think. That trust feels like a form of freedom. What if this was the Watchers' quiet legacy? Not rulers before Egypt, but teachers before certainty. They did not demand answers. They taught people how to live with questions. You move on with that thought. The past no longer feels like a set of hidden commands. It feels like a conversation still unfolding. You begin to notice echoes rather than origins now. The stories you have walked through no longer belong to one place or one people. They ripple outward, thinning and reshaping as they travel. What remains is not a clear line of descent, but a familiar pattern that keeps reappearing. Most historians agree that ideas from the ancient Near East influenced later cultures across the Mediterranean and beyond. Archaeology suggests that myths, symbols, and administrative concepts traveled through trade conquest and storytelling. The evidence we do have points to adaptation rather than inheritance. Ideas are borrowed, reshaped, and made local. You imagine a story told in a new language. The names sound different. The setting changes. But the structure remains. Oversight, balance, consequence. One interpretation is that Watcher-like figures survive as archetypes rather than characters. A more cautious explanation could be that societies independently arrive at similar solutions to similar problems. Historians still argue whether later traditions consciously referenced earlier myths or simply mirrored them unintentionally. Did storytellers know they were adapting something ancient, or did patterns emerge without awareness? The texts do not tell us. Influence is often quiet. What's broadly accepted is that later religions and philosophies feature beings who observe, judge, or guide without ruling directly. Angels, spirits, moral forces. A careful reading might suggest that the Watchers never vanished. They changed vocabulary. They moved from managing fields to observing hearts. You feel the scale shift. Early Watchers cared about canals and labor. Later Watchers care about intention and ethics. One interpretation is that as societies stabilize materially, oversight moves inward. A more cautious explanation could be that moral systems replace administrative ones when institutions grow strong enough to handle logistics. The evidence we do have points to continuity of concern rather than continuity of figure. Who ensures fairness when no one is watching? Who remembers promises when witnesses are gone? These questions persist across cultures. Watcher imagery answers them symbolically. A fringe idea proposes that all later Watcher figures derive from a single ancient source remembered imperfectly. This theory isn't widely accepted. Cultural exchange is complex and multidirectional. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still reveals a human desire for unified origin stories. You notice how later texts emphasize internal accountability. The Watcher sees thoughts, not just actions. One interpretation is that this reflects increased social complexity. External enforcement reaches limits. A more cautious explanation could be that moral teaching becomes more effective when internalized. Archaeology suggests that legal systems become more formalized as states grow, reducing the need for divine enforcement in daily life. Yet belief does not disappear. It transforms. Watchers become ethical ideals rather than supervisors. A more cautious explanation could be that belief fills gaps law cannot reach. Historians still argue whether this shift empowers individuals or burdens them. Being watched internally can inspire responsibility. It can also create anxiety. The texts reflect both outcomes. Comfort and fear coexist. You imagine a listener centuries later hearing a story about unseen watchers. The setting is no longer Mesopotamia. The river has a different name. But the feeling is recognizable. Actions matter beyond the moment. Someone notices. A popular rumor claims that ancient watcher myths directly inspired later religious doctrines word for word. This idea simplifies a complex process. Parallels exist, but so do divergences. If meaning traveled, it adapted to new values. The mystery here is not transmission. It is persistence. Why does the idea of being watched endure even when structures change? One interpretation is that social life requires trust beyond visibility. A more cautious explanation could be that humans seek reassurance that effort and restraint are meaningful. You feel how this brings the journey closer to the present. The Watchers are no longer distant gods or forgotten rulers. They are expectations woven into conscience. They are the sense that actions ripple outward. Historians still argue whether this continuity reflects shared psychology or shared history. The answer may be both. Culture and mind shape each other. You pause with the realization that the Watchers no longer need names. They survive as questions. Who holds us accountable when power fades? Who remembers when records fail? What if this was always their role? Not to rule before Egypt, but to accompany humanity through changing forms of order, to shift shape as needed, to remain just out of reach, so responsibility never fully disappears. You move forward gently now. The past feels less like a chain of secrets, and more like a pattern you can recognize without needing to solve. You sense the pace slowing on its own now, not because the story has run out, but because it no longer needs to push. The questions you began with feel different in your hands, lighter, less sharp. They have been turned enough times to soften their edges. Most historians agree that there is no clear evidence of a distinct group of rulers called Watchers governing the world before Egypt in a literal sense. Archaeology suggests continuous human development shaped by environment, technology, and social organization. The evidence we do have points to human systems evolving gradually, not being replaced wholesale by something hidden. And yet, the idea of the Watchers refuses to disappear. One interpretation is that it persists because it points at something real but abstract. Oversight, memory, accountability. A more cautious explanation could be that it is simply a compelling metaphor that survives because it remains useful. Historians still argue whether myths like these are better understood as records of belief or reflections of lived experience. Were people describing what they thought existed or what they felt operating around them? The texts do not separate those possibilities. They allow them to coexist. You reflect on how often the Watchers appeared not at moments of triumph, but at moments of uncertainty. Floods, expansion, legal reform, cultural transition. One interpretation is that the Watchers emerge when societies feel watched by consequences rather than people. A more cautious explanation could be that myth becomes active when control feels incomplete. The evidence we do have points to a recurring pattern. When human authority feels fragile, it is reinforced by something older, larger, or more distant. Watchers function as that reinforcement. They are invoked not to dominate, but to stabilize. A fringe idea proposes that the Watchers were misunderstood, memories of a vanished elite that influenced early civilizations and then faded. This theory isn't widely accepted. It relies on absence more than presence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still reveals a discomfort with purely human origins of power. You notice how often people prefer external explanations for systems that feel overwhelming. If order comes from Watchers, it feels less arbitrary, less negotiable. One interpretation is that this reduces anxiety. A more cautious explanation could be that it discourages dissent. Archaeology suggests that as institutions mature, myths shift away from administrative detail and toward moral meaning. The Watchers no longer measure grain, they measure conduct. That transition matters. It suggests that oversight follows need rather than tradition. Historians still argue whether this evolution represents progress. Have humans taken responsibility from the Watchers or simply internalized them? The evidence allows both readings. Law replaces ritual. Conscience replaces surveillance. But the structure remains. You feel how the original question has transformed. It is no longer about who ruled before Egypt. It is about why humans imagine rulers before rulers. Why authority is so often framed as inherited rather than invented. One interpretation is that continuity feels safer than novelty. A more cautious explanation could be that people trust systems more when they appear older than any individual. The Watchers give authority a past, even when the past is symbolic. A popular rumor claims that hidden knowledge still exists waiting to be decoded from ancient texts to reveal the true identity of the Watchers. This idea persists because it promises certainty. But certainty is not what these stories offer. They offer orientation. The mystery isn't in uncovering a final answer. It is in recognizing what the question itself reveals. Humans have always lived inside systems larger than themselves. Water cycles, trade networks, laws, stories. These systems watch outcomes unfold, whether anyone intends them to or not. You pause with that realization. The Watchers may never have ruled as beings of flesh and bone. But something watched. Patterns persisted. Balance corrected itself imperfectly, but persistently. Most historians agree that early civilizations laid the groundwork for everything that followed. What they also did, perhaps unintentionally, was teach later generations how to think about power without personifying it completely. You feel the journey drawing toward rest, not resolution. The Watchers no longer stand ahead of you. They stand around you, in habits, in expectations, in the quiet sense that actions matter even when no one is looking. What if that was always enough? You arrive without a clear sense of arrival. The landscape does not announce an ending. It simply opens and softens, as if the story knows it has carried you far enough. The Watchers, once outlined in sharp questions, now feel more like a presence you recognize, rather than something you need to define. Most historians agree that ancient Sumerian records do not describe a literal era where non-human watchers ruled the world before Egypt. Archaeology suggests layered human development, shaped by environment adaptation and social learning. The evidence we do have points to people building systems, revising them, and explaining them through story, when explanation felt necessary. Historians still argue whether myth should be read as belief metaphor or social memory. That debate remains open, and perhaps it always will. One interpretation is that Watchers were never meant to be identified as beings at all. A more cautious explanation could be that they represent the experience of living inside forces larger than any one person. You think back to the beginning, the rivers, the clay, the lists, the councils, the labor, the floods, the temples. None of these required secret rulers to function. They required coordination, attention, memory. One interpretation is that the Watchers were the language people used to talk about responsibility when responsibility became too complex to hold personally. The evidence we do have points to this pattern repeating again and again. When systems grow, oversight becomes abstract. When abstraction feels unsettling, it is given form. When form grows familiar, it fades back into structure. The Watchers appear at the hinge points. A fringe idea proposes that something concrete has been forgotten, that rulers existed and vanished, leaving only myth. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence supporting it is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still tells us more about the present than the past. We want origins to feel intentional. We want authority to feel older than us. You notice how calm the question feels now. Not solved, but settled. The mystery isn't in uncovering a hidden chapter before Egypt. The mystery is in how humans have always needed ways to explain order, accountability, and continuity without fully owning them. Historians still argue whether this need is psychological, social, or practical. The answer is likely a blend. People create stories to live inside systems they cannot fully control. Those stories do not need to be factual to be functional. You feel the Watchers, one last time, not as figures above you, but as patterns around you, rules that outlast individuals. Expectations passed quietly from one generation to the next. The sense that effort matters even when recognition fades. And now the pace slows deliberately. You no longer need to walk forward. You can sit with the ground beneath you. The air is still. The sounds soften. The long arc of time stretches behind you, not as a burden, but as a reassurance. People have been asking these questions for a very long time, and they have lived meaningful lives without answering them fully. Some parts of this story were documented. Some were interpretation. Some were gentle imagination. We kept the solid ground separate from the mist, and what remains is not a revelation, but a quiet understanding. You are not being watched now. You are being carried. The questions can rest. The watchers can rest. The story does not need to hold you anymore. Take a slow breath. Let the edges fade.